Thanks for your patience. And my name is Dario Sanfilippo, and my work is about complex adaptive systems for music. So now I will talk about what I call complex oscillators. So we'll see some networks which are self-oscillating. You trigger the networks with something, can be a one sample impulse or some noise, and then they start doing things on their own. And the whole point of my research is about a shift, or a paradigm shift in music composition. It's from composing with sounds to composing music systems that make music, basically. So it's this is the idea. It's the synthesis of forms and musical developments rather than the synthesis of just sounds. That would be the main idea or ambition. So when we talk of complex adaptive systems, there are a few things that we may want to specify, because sometimes there's a little bit of confusion, and even among the scholars and best thinkers in this field, there's sometimes is not agreement on how to define things in one single way. So when we talk of adaptive system, there are some characteristics which are agreed upon the most important scholars, and these are some of them. So an adaptive system is a system that has a relationship with its environment or context. And when I say environment, it's not necessarily the room where the things take place. It's anything which is defined as non-system. So if the system is a set of things doing things together, everything outside it is the environment or context. There's a relationship between the system and the context, and the system is capable of changing its configuration and structure based on information extracted by the context or from the context. So this is the first thing that usually you will hear when you talk about adaptive systems. And another thing that is usually connected to adaptive systems is to have some sort of goal or a tendency towards improving the fitness within the environment. In the musical perspective, we can maybe afterwards discuss what could be the goal of a system, or what could be having a better fitness in the musical context. And this Holland makes a distinction between fast dynamic and slow dynamic systems, which is also related to what we call time variant and time invariant systems. So technically, a time invariant system is a system that over time, if you give the same input, you have the same output. A time invariant system is something that changes over time. So the same input can cause different outputs. And it's basically technically if you think of a low-pass filter, you can give an input and there's also a cutoff frequency. If the cutoff frequency is fixed over time, that's a time invariant system. If it's changing over time, that makes it time variant. So if the variables of the system are changing over time, we can call it time variant. And that's a characteristic of adaptive systems, which is connected to this distinction of fast dynamic and slow dynamic systems. So fast dynamic is when you have variations in the output of the system that take place in the short time, whereas slow dynamic systems can have evolutions which take place in longer time spans. And like I said, there's a connection, there's a relationship between system and context which is continuous. It's an ongoing thing, it never stops. And that's what's called structural coupling. It's when the changes in the system will change the environment, and back they will change the system again. It's this coupling that happens through feedback relationships, and that's when Tom was presenting the oscillators, that's why they were interacting in such a way. And another important thing of adaptive systems is that there's some form of information processing, or minimal cognition, we can say. Because adaptive systems are provided with senses. They have to sense the environment and extract information in order to change themselves. And then, generally speaking, adaptive agents are made, I like the concept interaction between two subnetworks. One network is the detecting network, and the other network is the affecting network. So one is responsible for the information processing and the extraction of information from the context, and the other one is responsible for changing the context itself. And that's how the feedback loop is closed. So I'll try to be quick with the slides because I would like to listen to as much music as possible. I think it's 1 hour of sine waves. I mean, so then the idea of complexity is also, it's not easy to describe in one way and agree on how it can be defined in a way which is agreed from all the scholars. But there are some characteristics which are shared by pretty much all complex systems. So one of the things is that it's a fairly large network of interacting components, and the components interact in a nonlinear way. And that's based on the superposition principle. It's a nonlinear thing. So if you sum two inputs, you don't have the sum of the two outputs. So it's
if you sum two inputs, you do not.
If you have a system, if you give input A, you have output A1. If input B1, you have output B1. If you sum the two inputs A and B, you don't get B1 plus A1. It's another thing. So that's a non-superposition principle. And there's a combination of positive and negative feedback loop relationships. A positive feedback loop is something that tends towards explosion or exponential growths or exponential decays, whereas negative feedback is something that pushes and tries to keep the system around an equilibrium point. So these two things are intrinsically opposite tendencies. So the fight among positive and negative feedback loops is what makes magic happen in the systems. And a complex system has no centralized control. There's not like an agent which says to the other agents, you do this or you do this other. So the organization happens through, it's an emergent property of the system. It's self-organized, and it's because of the interaction among components. So it's said to be distributed. The control is distributed. And the behaviors of complex systems are intrinsically emergent. So the final characteristics of the systems are not addressable to the single or to the sum of the characteristics of the single components. And an interesting thing to say about emergent systems, they usually define them as the sum is the system is more than the sum of the parts. But it's actually even less, because in an emergent system, some of the characteristics that you may have in the single components are lost, and that's so the system is also less than the sum of the parts. And I think it's interesting. And the most important thing is probably the edge of chaos. So if you have a system, or if you imagine a scale where you have on one side it's a total predictable behavior, on the other side is a completely chaotic behavior, the complexity happens somewhere in between those two. It's when you have an interplay between order and disorder, and a nonlinear interaction between these two behaviors. So the system oscillates between these two things. Sometimes you have a pattern, sometimes you have an evolution which you cannot predict, sometimes it goes back to a pattern. But all these things, from the musical perspective, are a little bit more difficult to identify, and also it's intrinsically it is related to an observer. It's a subjective task to say when something is complex or not. And this is also, from a technical perspective or a scientific perspective, the approach of Bonnebaut for the detection of, for the definition of emergence, which is strictly related to the concept of complexity, is approached by this scholar as something that necessarily needs an observer. But the observer can also be an algorithm, as long as the observer is capable of detection. This is consistent with the idea of complexity in music, and the fact that an observer or a listener is supposed to perceive it as complex. And a fundamental thing in detecting complexity in music is the time scale that we're observing, of course. For example, for the project where Till is one of the main project developer and head of this Rotting Sounds project I'm not the head. But one of the main contributors here. I have implemented a sound installation which evolves in a time span of 3 months. So anyone who visits the work within 1 hour, you will probably think that it's boring because it's not changing. But if you take a time scale which is much larger, you will see complexity arising. So the time scale is fundamental, as well as the threshold, because the threshold of the, because of the resolution of the ears, variations according to thresholds can be called as such. Otherwise, variations which are too small will not be detected as the actual variations. And this is the idea that I was talking about, the edge of chaos in the musical realm is when you have an interplay between patterns and evolving behaviors. So when there's a development and then there's something which goes around the thing, and you can explore the behavior a little bit more. And one thing which I find also very interesting is the variation on the size of the state space of the complexity. So it means that a system can have a limited number of states. Let's say that it's 10 states. So if you want to oscillate between order and disorder, maybe you can go around 2 states, and this is an ordered behavior, and then you can go in a non-predictable way around 10 states. But then over time it will be interesting to see this kind of variations in order and disorder when it taking place over different number of states. So it's like applying this idea of edge of chaos at levels which are higher and higher. So the first one is on the output of the system, the other one is on the output of the complexity itself. And these are some of the reasons why I think that complex adaptive systems are particularly useful. And so for me, the reason why I work with complex systems is not because they're cool. It's because
They are cool.
I think they are. But that's not the reason. That's probably because I'm a bad performer. Because with complex systems, when I let the system have formal choices in my performances, sometimes they come out with something that I think I would have never been able to do on my own. So if it's just me controlling the system and improvising a performance, I end up doing things which are maybe repetitive and not so interesting. Whereas if I let the machine do some of the formal work, I see some developments which are particularly interesting and reflect my aesthetics more. So it's really...
Let's level.
Yeah. So maybe I'm not a good performer, like I said, but maybe you could do that on your own and you don't need complex systems. And this is because of what I call the objectivity of the machine. So for example, when I used to improvise as a laptop performer and do things more or less on my own, I realized that I was going back to some configurations of the parameters again and again because I like how they were sounding. So I wasn't objective towards exploring my system. But if you let the system explore itself, there's an objectivity because it's just based on the context, and the context changes all the time. But there's not a tendency towards being in one set of configurations than another. So I found that there's an exploration and variety which is more convincing for me if I do this. And this is what, when I say that for me it sounds better, it's this idea of losing control to actually gain complexity. So for me, the most successful performance currently is when I start my system, I initialize my system with whatever I give as an input. It can be an impulse or some noise. And then if the system does things for 25 minutes and I don't need to touch it, that's the most successful performance for me. And working with these systems has also, in the spirit of human-machine interaction performance, it helps to have a more musical output because the system is structurally related to the context. And this thing provides an expressiveness that I haven't achieved in other ways. For example, when you use randomness in music systems, randomness is calculated on a different domain. There's no interaction between randomness and the output of the system in most cases. And the fact of having the systems that work it's like a single voice, but very layered. So you have lots of layers, but they all interact in a structural level. So in the end, it's like a single voice, which works in a very organic way, but it's quite complex even at the level at the low level of sound itself, because you have lots of layers. but you can change one parameter and make this voice shift on completely different behaviors. And the paradigm shift is, of course, from sound to music synthesis. And the fact that these systems could be used for disabled people. If you don't have the capability of moving lots of parameters, you can move one, if you can have an interface between EEG and one parameter which pilots the system, and you can still have lots of expressiveness in your performance. So this is something that I would like to work on if possible. And then this is the essence of my research now. This is what I'm trying to implement. The idea of extending the
Just imagine.
the idea of extending adaptivity at all levels in a system. So it's what I call distributed adaptation and also meta-adaptivity, because there's in one of the systems that we will listen to now, the adaptivity infrastructure is adaptive itself, and it changes according to the context. So the system over time will adapt in a different way around the context. So you have a system that if you have 4 agents, like we'll see, maybe one is a reverb, the other one is filters, the other one is is something else, some other effect. These nodes over time will change. So the reverberator will be interpolating from being a reverberator to being a granulator. So the topology will be adaptive. It will go from a circular topology to a fully connected. So all the elements in the network in the end will be autonomous. So the system will compose itself, and that's why I call them autopoietic. And yeah, that's about it, mostly. And maybe let's listen to some sine waves. So some examples that we might listen to are, first we can listen to some single agents being fed back into themselves. And this just is adaptive behavior. There's some information processing. We can also have a look at the information processing algorithms. I'm using some heretical techniques for some of them, because I'm using FFT, for example, for the spectral tendency. It's all time domain. It's a couple of filters, and it still works. And then we'll see what happens when we put them together. So, for example, so this is a model from a feedback delay network reverberator. The difference is that it's a self-oscillating system, so the feedback coefficients are above the stability threshold, and the stability is realized through look-ahead limiters. There are other techniques to keep it stable. You can use cosine functions or saturators, but those introduce a little bit too much noise. So I use them in some cases. In this case, I prefer to use look-ahead limiters because they keep the sound clean. And in this case, there is the adaptivity behavior is on the length of the delay lines. So the length of each, I think it's a 16th order, and they should change at some point. And in this case, I usually make a distinction between abstract information processing and perceptual information processing. If you use spectral tendency, like brightness, that's perceptually related to what we hear. But there are other techniques through which you can process the sound and obtain a control signal or information signal that you can then map and control variables. Also, in my systems are all deterministic. There's no randomness. So if it's unpredictable, it's because it's emergent. And all the information signals are below 15 Hertz. 15 Hertz is the threshold for us, among which we're not able to distinguish individual events. We merge them together. So it's rather than favoring timbral variations, it's to focus on formal variations in the system. No. This is just me. Okay, but this volume changes because a delay line has changed and the Larsen that was engaging has been stopped. So this is what gives formal development in this piece, for example. This is a very simple system. There's not much going on.
So but the adaptation is basically on a higher level or on a different level happening than on the term on the signal.
It's not audio. I mean, it's audio rate, but the signal is sub audio.
Okay.
So it's in this case, I think that what I'm doing here is to low pass for each signal that is fed back. There's a fourth order low pass filter, but it's like the cutoff is 1/64, I think. So it's really slow. In the end, you have a signal which is really tiny. So I've implemented a dynamical normalizator. So there's a reference, which is the signal, and then there's the low pass, which is the target signal. With the RMS, you calculate the normalization factor, so it keeps it at the same level. And you use that. And then what I do is usually, since I don't really like glissandi in most cases, unless they're really slow, I just sample and hold whenever there's a variation in the signal, a variation of direction. For example, yes.
Is that going in Faust?
Yeah.
And what is it that choice?
Sorry?
Why is it that choice? Is there a particular reason
Why Faust?
Yes.
Because it's really efficient, and the problem I've been working with PD, but I was having problems with PD single precision. And Super Collider is too enclosed. You don't really know what's happening in most of the things. This is a low-level thing. You can implement filters easily. It's some wise operations are just normal. You don't have to change both sides. It's embedded in the C++ code that is generated and then compiled. And it's really, the syntax is really difficult, I have to say. It took me a long time before I got my head around the thing, and maybe for others it's easy. It's extremely efficient. That's true. This is a 16th order network, and there's variable delay lines, so fractional delays, and I think it's a 6th order polynomial, and still it's like what is it? It's okay. But I think it could have been better. I think that when the power is not connected, the CPU load changes a lot in my. I don't know if I hope it's that, but usually it's much more efficient than pure data. That's for sure.
Can you change the impulse signal right now?
Sorry, in this case, did I say that it was an no? I opened the microphone for some time at the beginning.
It's microphone.
Now it's
closed.
The original.
Yeah.
Source.
Yeah. Exactly.
But can you use a different sound?
Yeah.
With more harmonics, for example?
Yeah, then they will resonate for some time, but then maybe they go away. Depends on because the fundamental resonant frequencies of the network change based on the delays, the delay lines.
I was just wondering if you could demonstrate it maybe quickly to hear a different sound than the.
Well, we can close this and open again. Is that what you asked?
Noise?
Yeah, let's make some noise. Noise. Thank you.
Different output, same behavior, more or less. So, I mean, one important thing actually to say is that even in the system that exhibit the most variety and complexity, it's still a piece, because you can still recognize the system and its behaviors. It's like you play with your friend, you like the way your friend plays, but you never know what's going to happen, right? And that's the idea. When I play with my systems, it's called like a duo, and I really try to let the system express itself as much as possible. Right, you get the idea. It must have been like lots of DC, probably. So some other example. This is one sample impulse, and it's for this project I was talking about before, this sound installation that evolves in a 3-month time span. So this is also based on a model of a feedback delay network reverberator. So the delay lines are chosen as prime or co-prime lengths, so you take the energy as distributed as possible in the spectrum. And then in this case, the stability, it's also a self-oscillating system, but the stability is made possible through saturators. Since the idea of this project is digital deterioration. So here there's a time variant parameter, it's the feedback coefficient is growing. So in 3 months, it will grow of a magnitude of 1. So if it's a 16th order network, the stability threshold is 0.25 for the feedback coefficients. So it will be 1.25 after 3 months. But as it grows, the harmonics will be increasing because of the saturators, because they will produce more and more harmonics and distortion. And that's how the sound deteriorates. But the harmonics will also be interacting, so there will be lots of intermodulation distortion and beats phenomena. And at some point we will go through phase transitions, which is what Tom was describing in his systems when he was moving the fader up and the system was shifting from one side to the other of the behaviors. So phase transitions are some of the most interesting aspects of nonlinear iterated systems, because magic happens in those situations, because it's really delicate, it's very sensitive to whatever is happening around them, and there's lots of dynamical behaviors. So the adaptivity control here is that whenever a phase transition is detected, the feedback coefficients are frozen, so that this area can be explored as much as possible. And the phase transition is detected simply as the derivative of the spectral tendency, because it's very likely that if you have a phase transition, you have a change in the spectral tendency. So this is a version of the work which extends over 1 hour, but still we can get an idea of how it starts evolving.
We can listen to the live thing.
But it's an early stage, so it's just a sine
but
wave. But we love those.
I mean, I have it open.
Okay. So this, if we listen to this in a month, hopefully there will be much more behavior and things happening.
You don't say if you invested a month in it.
When you're designing those, do you have any means for like fast forwarding? Or you just hope that, or instead you left it for 3 months and go back and okay.
But you know, that's an interesting question, because when it's not like stretching the process. You cannot just stretch the sound file, for example. If you stretch the process, you have a different behavior, because you will let other things emerge, and some others may not emerge, whereas they could have emerged if the process was stretched out in time. So the observation process of the system, if you change the time scale, you change the behavior necessarily. But here's a little bit more behavior. We can start hearing the bits, and these things will eventually become more interesting.
Can you somehow set the frequency scale that it doesn't go too low or too high? Or
you can force the system with, you can put constraints, just like Tom did with filters.
Okay, yeah.
So if you can also have a detection of the peaks in the spectrum, and if the peaks that you don't want, you can filter them out with a notch, or so there's any kind of self-regulation is possible. And I mean, this is the role of the composer. That's why you do it. You shape the behavior of the system so that it sounds according to your aesthetics. That's the idea. That's like having a system that structurally outputs a complex sonic output, and then the work of the composer is to do all the calibration so that it sounds the way you really like it, or the way that is really convincing from your objective perspective of good music or complex music. Because what's the goal of a music system? For me, it's to keep complexity over time. That's what, for me, a successful piece of music is. And one interesting thing that we may think of is also the idea of relative redundancy. So if we think of a minimalist piece, the idea of variation changes, so the time scale and threshold changes for the brain, because we adapt to the context where the variation is so little that tiny things will actually increase the complexity of the overall output quite a lot. Whereas if you have a music piece which starts with lots of variations and things that are changing, the threshold is set much higher, I think. So that's why the size of the complexity state space is also very important in the detection of complexity. And so so now let's listen to an example on TV.
It just looks much more complex already.
Well, this is in this case we have 8 agents. So we have hum filters, frequency shifting filters. These are just one row, one pole units that oscillates between being high pass and low pass, because the coefficient is adapted. And then there's a granulator, nonlinear transfer function, but it's the transfer function is written by the sound, which changes the sound, which changes the transfer function. So it's a recursive nonlinear transfer. The transfer function is also time variant, basically. There's the reverberator, sampler, and pass width modulation. So what I'm doing here is to so this still doesn't have the distributed adaptation I was talking about. This is just adaptive. Some of the variables in the system are piloted by the information processing of each of the agents based on the context. But the system is creating the context because it's self-referential in this case. So there's this topology, which is what you call quasi-fully connected, because the output of each unit goes in the input of all the others except itself. And when I click on this, I will open this microphone for 1 millisecond, and that will be the trigger for the system. there is quite a bit going on, and the system settles down around this area. And what I will do is to perform by moving these faders. These faders change the mapping between the information signals and the variables in the agent. But then I thought, okay, let's let the system do this. And that's how the idea of distributed adaptation came out.
Is there something, because you listen to this quite a lot, I guess, already, is there something that you especially like about what you hear? Or is there something that you especially do not like about what you hear?
The output of the system.
Yes.
They really challenge my brain. Sometimes they come out with really abstract things. For me, the non-predictability in music is really important, but not predictable in a non-trivial way.
Do you have a concrete example in what we just listened to? Like what is it the change of pitch or timbre or something else?
In this case, there wasn't enough. I mean, at the beginning, at the beginning, there was a development which was convincing for me.
Mm-hmm.
The way it was growing. But I mean, it was more convincing the thing that we listened to earlier, the first feedback delay network, when it was the silences, the way the silences were happening, that was very convincing for me.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't have this patience in a performance to wait and let the other sounds come through maybe after 1 minute of silence. So it's somehow, and if the other example, which is a preview of tonight's performance, is to use the system where the adaptation is distributed, and this mapping function change over according to the context. So this, when I opened the network, the microphone was open for 1 millisecond.
So you've set these kind of listening agents to listen and change settings. It's got that kind of stuff going on. How much do you kind of make them do things that you think you like? Like, are you trying to get them to do, like, oh, I'll give it this range of sort of possibilities because I think that'll be good. Like, that's what I like. Or you kind of give it fairly free rein?
No, I mean, you can start with this calibration process is the final the phase of the implementation of a piece, and it's what really makes the difference of flow. So you can start with having an idea. I mean, if you map a control signal, an information signal which is in the 0 to 1 range over the frequency of a filter, you don't want to filter at 40K.
Yeah.
Doesn't make sense, right? You can have ranges which you can think of, but then in the global behavior of the machine, that make not much sense. So you can shape after you see the output, you can shape the behavior basically. It's a process that it takes even quite some time. And I'll still keep on changing this after maybe 2 years.
But how far would you go? Because I mean, you could constrain something like the filter. Yeah, okay, you could say let's keep it to 40 to 400 instead of. You could also say, okay, you can only do multiples of 55, or like within a tolerance of that, it kind of moves around like this instead. You could really push it with those if you want, but you want to leave some space there.
Yeah, so, I mean, I want the system to constrain itself. So sometimes the size of the cutoff variations are this, and after maybe 2 minutes, the system can go through a much higher range of possibilities.
Yeah, okay, you can move it to space.
That's why these things so different come out.
But then the question applies to the processes you set in place to like manage the managing processes. Like you give that a certain range of constraints within a space you like.
Yeah.
Like so a tendency to be in the lower frequencies rather than higher. And yeah.
Yeah, you can go, the constraints can happen at all levels.
Right.
Yeah.
It'd be really interesting to see like a catalogue of all the kind of things you feel like you've imposed, like as aesthetic sort of impositions.
All the tree, but yeah, I mean this thing comes from the idea of implementing machines which are based on a model of radical constructivism, because the idea is that what happens in a radical constructive perspective is that the information changes the information processing, which changes information. So there's a feedback loop between information and information processing, and that's what I'm implementing here. It follows this. So based on context, you have an information processing infrastructure. You have the spectral tendency, which is piloting the cutoff of a filter. But what if, based on information which has been extracted by the context, the control signal changes? So it's not the spectral tendency, but it's the RMS controlling that variable over time. So that's the kind of dynamicity that you create in the network and the infrastructure. The autopoietic idea is also that. And I've realized that this kind of approach is actually particularly useful for long-term variety and complexity. It really helps. Yeah. As you know, it's almost silent. Okay. Would you like to ask something? Yes.
Yes, I have a question. Very interesting. Thank you for the talk. Until I have the feeling by listening and the sonic outcome that this is somehow platform or even language independent. Is that true? Like, if you implement the same set of ideas into a Raspberry Pi, let's say, or into a PC, would you expect the same?
It's all different equations, yeah.
The same, but you will expect. You have some expectations about the sound quality and the sound outcome.
It is machine independent. I mean, I have some systems that I have in pure data, which I have implemented in Faust. I've just done the porting and they sound as I expect. I mean, with the difference that in Faust you have double precision. But if you use single precision, I mean, they also use the same compilers. So it's C or C++. I don't think that there will be any difference. It will be deterministic even in that. But yeah, the systems are machine independent because it's just different equations. Everything is in the time domain. And yeah.
I was wondering, maybe you mentioned how you extract information from the signal.
I use RMS to track the energy of the signal. There's also peak envelopes for the peaks of the amplitudes. And then there's spectral tendency, which is a form of centroid, because it's a balancing point. I just calculate, I mean, there's the algorithm, it calculates itself the cutoff of a crossover at which the RMS output of the crossover and the high spectrum and low spectrum is the same. So if the energy is the same, that's the spectral tendency, that's the balancing point in the spectrum. And I mean, this difference in the energy is used. So this spectral balance outputs the difference of the energy of the high and low spectrums coming out from the crossover. We know that if the difference is positive, there's more energy in the high spectrum. If it's negative, there's more. If it's positive, there's more. No, actually, it's the high energy minus the low energy. So if it's positive, the high spectrum is stronger. Otherwise, it's the other way around. So the magnitude of that difference, it tells you how much away you are from the balancing point. The sign, it tells you where to move, and that output is fed back into itself to self-regulate. And then you have this difference is integrated so that it moves for as long as it needs to move, and then it stops. And then you have it's necessary to make the system more stable because you want to give more resolution in the low side because it's most likely you will have spectral tendencies around the low frequencies. And then it's this difference is normalized based on the energy of the input, because you want it to be amplitude independent, basically. So if it's a really tiny input, if you divide a quantity by a tiny quantity, so it will be around unity, so more or less.
And what is the size of the window then?
That's the responsiveness of the system. So for example, with a responsiveness of 100, this is when I feed the system with a, guess what, 1K sine wave? I get this behavior. So the system, these are samples, it's a 48K sample rate. So the system settles down after about 10 milliseconds, so, which is what you expect. And it's this window is the window of the RMS calculation, which is the frequency of the low pass. Because for the RMS, I take the input, I take the square root, then I average it through one pole low pass filters, and then I take the so I square them at the beginning, then low pass, and then square root for the calculation in real time of the RMS. So it's
yes, and the low pass was like 0.15 hertz, something like that. Did you?
If the low pass will have a cutoff of 100 hertz, if the responsiveness is supposed to be 100 hertz. So if you fit the low pass with a step function, it will go from 0 to 1 in 10 milliseconds, more or less. And yeah, and what you also do is, of course, to multiply the integration rate by the window, because if you want it to grow faster, you have to multiply that value to integrate faster. But I mean, it works pretty well, because this is, you cannot see it here. I don't know why, but this is exactly 1K. So the spectral tendency is calculated really exactly by the algorithm. And you see these ripples here. These are because of the negative feedback loop in the system. So we can see that this dynamical equilibrium also applies to the system because of the negative feedback loop and the self-regulation. So it oscillates around 1K, but it's good enough for my purposes. And it's just it's what is it? It's one crossover with first order filters, and then two RMS calculations. It's really computationally efficient. And then the other one that I use is noisiness, which is based on zero crossing rate. But usually zero crossing rate is, for noisiness, is used on special cases, like when you want to analyze voiced versus unvoiced sounds, or percussive and non-percussive sounds. But if you feed like a 20K sine wave to a zero crossing rate, you have a really high value, but it's anything but noise. So what I think is that the variation in the zero crossing rate is actually what determines the noisiness, because it's the non-periodicity that makes a difference. So I take the derivative of the zero crossing rate over a time which is tuned by the spectral tendency, so that the value is based around the most energy in the spectrum. And that's also mapped over a logarithmic function, because if you have variations in the zero crossing rate at low values, you want it to have to be as important as variations in the zero crossing rate at high values, because of the logarithmic perception, and it works pretty well. And then the high level, what else do I use? Yeah, these are the main things: RMS, noisiness, and spectral tendency. And then I have high level algorithms for dynamicity index and complexity index. And this dynamicity is based on how much these three things move over time, and then they are combined together in a nonlinear way. I use a hyperbolic tangent function to sum them in a nonlinear way. Because if one of them is moving a lot and the other ones are not moving, it's not like you can expect that an output is dynamical for just 1/3. And one low-level characteristics moving a lot, it should contribute to the dynamicity a lot. So that's why they summed up in a nonlinear way. And the complexity is based on this idea of order and disorder, so how much the system moves from ordered behaviors to unpredictable behaviors. So it's derivative, so it detects the changes in the heterogeneity of the states of this single information processing units.
Okay, we're a little bit over time now,
Yeah, I think
so
my throat is
your throat is over time.